So, you want to be a better angler, right? Well, I reckon we all do. But there is so much to focus on in fly fishing. You've got all these different techniques you can learn and fancy casting styles and fly patterns to memorize. Where should you actually spend your time if you really want to level up and unlock your potential as an angler? On today's show, I'll take you in depth on the three things that, more than anything else, will help you unlock your fly fishing potential. This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Co. Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled, and I am your host, Spencer Durant. I got a question recently that I just couldn't resist diving into here on the show, so I want to thank Emily from Colorado for sending this in. I'm going to read her whole question. She wrote, I just started fly fishing this summer, and I feel like I'm doing almost all the things right so far. Always so much to learn. I'm looking for bugs and flies, reading the water, checking reports, talking to the fly shop. In your opinion, what is the biggest factor that can help beginners get to the next level and start landing more fish? Emily, I want to answer your question with a story, but like I already mentioned in the hook to the show, I do have a list of 3 things that you all will want to focus on to unlock your full fly fishing potential. So stay tuned for those. They're coming right after the story. But let's start out with a little bit of a story time. And back in high school, I used to drive up to the Lower Provo River to go fly fishing. Now, I know you're thinking, oh, great, here Durant goes again, another Lower Provo bash session, because I throw it right under the bus almost every week on the show. It's kind of an issue, but it kind of deserves it these days. That river has become a zoo. It used to be just this wonderful little place to fish. It used to just be a nice, I think it was 25 minutes from where I used to live. It was a wonderful retreat. And then I moved away, of course, and I started to fish a lot of different rivers, and I realized that it's not that good. It's kind of like how Alex thinks that Coke Zero is great, but then once you have Diet Coke, you realize you were missing out on so much that this world had to offer. Anyways, if you've ever been to the Lower Provo, it is not a river with the most obvious holes and runs. It's not a place where you could take a beginner and have them point out, oh, this is where a fish is going to be, and this is where a fish is going to be. It's just a tough river to decipher at times, and it doesn't help that the vast majority of the fish that are caught on nymph rigs fished at the bottom of runs, and all the runs in this river look very featureless on top. There's no crystal clear reach out and smack you, hey, there's a fish here, buddy, types of water features on the Lower Provo. And I can't count how many times in high school and after high school that I went to the Lower Provo and I threw every fly in my box at those daggum fish, and then I still got skunked anyways. I can't count it. But I had an inkling of what to do at the very least. I knew, like I mentioned, that the most productive way to fish this river is with small scuds and sow bugs on your nymph rigs. But I had no clue about reading water. I had zero idea about getting to the right depth or presentation in general. I just didn't know what I didn't know. So I'd catch a fish every now and then, but there was no regularity to it. I was just lucking into the fish. Well, after months and months of this happening, I honestly don't know how long I went up there and got my butt kicked, because I also heard from everybody that, oh, it's a tough river and it'll kick your butt, but you'll learn eventually. And that was the most help that anybody ever gave me with it. So I just licked my wounds and realized, you know what? Okay, fine. I'm getting my butt kicked, but everybody said I would. Well, I finally got frustrated of driving up there, not catching anything, and more importantly, not being able to build off of the few successes that I'd had. So I finally sat down and tried to see if I could find a pattern to any of this madness that I'd been dealing with. So I actually hand drew a map of the river, and I marked out all the spots where I've caught fish, what I was using, and the rig that I had tied up. I started keeping track of that. And slowly, I started to piece together that I was catching the most fish with consistency when I was deep enough in the areas of the river where the current was a bit slower and the depth was a bit deeper as well. Now, I know that I was having luck because I drift my nymphs enough times through what we call a run, but I had no clue what a run was at that point. This is also, however, when I started heavily consuming as much fly fishing content as I could get my little hands on. I was bugging my dad and my grandpa to explain things to me, and I was just spending as much time as I could learning and trying to understand what I was screwing up on. Because I'd go there and I'd watch other people catch fish, and I'd even ask them for flies, and they'd show me their rig, and I could just never make it all click. But once I was able to match my experiences to what I was reading about and what I was learning about, that is when everything started to click for me. If I had to distill this entire experience down to just one piece of advice, it's going to be this. The single biggest thing that you can do to level up your skills is to go fishing as much as you can and to learn as much as you can. Those two things, learn as much and go fish as much as you possibly can. So, Emily, you're doing everything that you should be. You're doing it right. The only thing that's going to take you from someone who occasionally catches fish, who's lucking into them, to someone who consistently catches fish is time on the water where you can learn. That is the key takeaway. We've got to learn. You've got to learn more. You've got to spend your time on the water. Yes, books and videos are going to help a ton. And that's the whole thing that we do here at VFC is teach and help you guys lower this learning curve so that you can go out there and not be frustrated like I was for all that time. But all the books and videos are no substitute for time on the water. I want to make that very clear. Now, I'm sure some of you have heard me talk about this concept before here on the show, but a lot of folks who just don't know any better, they'll often ask a variation of the question, hey, I'm going fishing tomorrow. What flies are the fish hitting on right now? They ask this question because I think there's this idea out there that there's some kind of magic fly that exists that the fish will eat 100% of the time. They'll snack on it and life will be grand. Now, obviously that's not true. It doesn't exist. If it did exist, I want to talk to whoever's got it because there's a 30-inch fish that I need to go get revenge on. But it doesn't exist. And it's that same thing with becoming a better angler. There is no silver bullet solution. That's why I drew this analogy. Just like there's no magic fly, there is no silver bullet solution that's going to work to make you a better angler like that. It just doesn't exist. Yeah, you might learn a lot more quickly than somebody else, but you still have to put that time in on the water to improve. It took me a very long time. I don't think, in talking with Alex, I don't think it took him as long to master some of the things as it took me. So you've got two guys. Alex is fantastic at nymphing. I prefer dry fly fishing. I'd say skill-wise, Alex and I are on par with each other. I don't think one of us is a head and shoulders better angler than the other, but it both took us different amounts of times to learn the skill sets that we have. So don't beat yourself up. Beat yourself up if you feel like it's taking you too long. But what exactly should you be focusing on, right? The goal here is to move from lucking into fish every now and then into consistently putting fish in the net. Well, this is where my three things come into play that I mentioned earlier, right? I'm going to dive into these. We're going to, if you can pay attention to these three things and learn as much about them as you possibly can, this will help you be more successful earlier on in your career than anything else. So first thing to focus on is reading water. I mentioned this a little bit in my Lower Provo story, but this really is a foundational skill for everything else in fly fishing, because if you can't look at a piece of water and tell me, yeah, a fish should be there, and there, then nothing else matters. You could have the best drift in the world. You could have the perfect fly. Your casting could be so good that people want to feature you as a casting model on Instagram. You could win tournaments, but none of that matters. None of that amounts to squat unless you can look at a piece of water and identify where the fish are going to be. Because if you can't put your flies there, you're never going to catch anything. That's a big stumbling block, and that's why so many beginners luck into fish, because they're not actually reading the water. We have an entire module of our beginner fly fishing masterclass that's dedicated to reading water. I'll link those videos in the show notes for y'all to look at and to learn more about it. But in general, what you're looking for in a river is water that's moving at about a walking speed pace. That is the perfect speed for fish to hold. They don't have to spend too much energy in that water. And then the pace of that current's also bringing them a nice steady diet of food. Kind of like me at Thanksgiving when I just sit on the couch and watch football. And when I run out of turkey, I yelled to my mother-in-law, "Hey, Laura, I need another plate of turkey." And then she tells me, "Yeah, get up and get it yourself, fatso." She doesn't add the fatso part. That was a me thing. Mother-in-law's great. Anyways, it doesn't matter what type of water you're fishing. It could be a riffle, a run, or even pocket water. And those are all water types that we discuss in that beginner masterclass that I mentioned. But the idea is that no matter what type of water you're fishing, you still want that walking speed water. That's where the fish are going to be most of the time. And they'll also hold in pools too. Now, pools are a lot slower. The middle of the pool is not moving very much, and the fish like that because they can hang out in the pool, not spend too much energy, but they still have access to quite a bit of food. However, you'll find more fish in the head and the tail of the pool usually than the middle, where the current's faster at the head and the tail. So you can focus on those as well when you go to the head and tail of a pool. Now, there is one other feature to be aware of within that walking speed water. There's also going to be a feature that we call a seam. Now, all a seam is it's where fast and slow water meet up, and fish love to hang out on seams. So if you're on a river and let's say there's a pool and there's a big rush of current coming by on one side of it, and you see where the fast water of the current and the slow water of the pool meet, there's going to be a seam. You'll want to drift your flies there because A, it's going to be about walking speed water in the seam, but B, fish love to hang out on seams because they can hang out in the slow water and not spend much energy. Again, they want to be lazy. They want to spend the least amount of energy for the most amount of food. So they can hang out in the slow water, but they can keep an eye on what's coming by in the fast water. They can dart out and eat it and then go back into the slow water and just kick back, relax, and do whatever trout do down there while we're not catching them. Again, we've got tons of resources on reading water. Those are all linked in the show notes. This is an absolutely vital skill. You definitely need to take your time to learn this, and this really will level you up exponentially. So that's our first point. Point number 2, we're going to talk about the bugs for a minute. Now, I should say that I've been getting a little, I wouldn't call it grief, but some folks have helpfully pointed out on YouTube that aquatic insects and bugs are different things. And yes, they are, but I don't want to say the phrase aquatic insects 50,000 times every podcast and YouTube video because it starts to get stale after a while. So I'm mixing in bugs and aquatic insects. I'm referring to the same thing. I know technically they're not the same, but I'm just referring to them the same. Now, point number 2, we've got to focus on our bugs, but what specifically about them? Well, you need to understand the general trend of bugs throughout the course of a year and learn how to identify what bugs the fish are most likely eating. So let me paint a picture for you here. During the winter, your water temps are very cold. The bugs aren't active as a result of that. And the fish aren't going to be very active either, okay? Midges really are the only bug that you're going to have hatch during the winter. Now, as winter goes away and the weather warms up, you start to see some spring mayfly hatches. And then we start to see some caddis come early summer. Around June, you'll start to see stoneflies hatching in earnest. You'll have stoneflies and caddis and mayflies and drakes all hatching together. They'll peter out towards the end of summer. And then once the water is really warmed up, the bug activity dies down noticeably, but that's when your terrestrial fishing with things like grasshoppers picks up. And then once things start to cool down and we move into fall, your mayfly hatches start again. You got some October caddis, the trichos come out, and the fish start getting really aggressive as they prepare to spawn or pack the pounds on for winter, or they're doing both. So the general trend to remember here is that the bugs, and therefore the fish, are the most active when the water temps are between 45 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit. I don't know what that is in Celsius, and for our listeners outside of the U.S., just move to Fahrenheit already, man. It's superior. Oh, anyways, the most active the bugs are going to be is from late spring to late summer. That's when there's the most bug activity. So consequently, that's when there's going to be the most fish activity as well. There's the water's cool. The fish are just happy to eat. That's the best time of year to be out and get into quite a few fish. Now, as far as identifying those bugs, we understand the trend, right? Late spring to late summer, that's your best season. But how do you identify exactly which one is the fly that they're eating? Well, this is a skill that comes with time, but we've actually got a ton of resources dedicated to this as well. In fact, we are launching a fly selection masterclass. It's live right now. It's not even we are. It's not past tense. We're doing it. You can go check out the first 2 episodes of it. I'll throw a link to those in the show notes. It's a whole masterclass about how to pick the right fly and how to understand more about aquatic insects so you can catch more fish. I would recommend starting there and taking a look at some of our other resources to actually identify the bugs. But you need to understand their trends, how they change throughout the seasons, how the mayflies start in the spring, and then they're really good again in the fall, and when the caddis come off and when the stoneflies come off. Studying that stuff is going to help you be that much more confident when you go out to the water, because then you've already got a fairly good baseline of when bugs are hatching. So you can go out in June and say, yeah, it's stonefly time. I'm going to throw a Pat's rubber leg nymph and imitate some stonefly nymphs. It clicks better when you have that background info of the bugs and their timing. So spend some time on that. And then the third thing to focus on, if you really want to up your skills, is getting the right drift. Now, you can identify the right water and the absolute perfect fly. But if you don't present that fly in a way that makes the fish think it's the real thing, you're going to have a very, very tough time catching any fish. Okay. Of all the things I mentioned, I think this is the one that takes the most work, because it's not something you can just read up on while you're pretending to work. You actually have to go out and do it. You've got to be on the water for this one. But what you need to focus on with your presentation is twofold. You've got to get your flies to the right spot, and then you've got to eliminate drag. By getting your flies to the right spot, what I'm talking about is those flies need to be in the strike zone. The strike zone is just a term we use to refer to wherever throughout the water column the fish are eating at any given moment. Something like 90% of a trout's diet is subsurface, so more often than not, the fish are eating nymphs. They're sitting down there, they're chilling on the bottom of the river, eating as many nymphs as they can. So if you're going to fish with nymphs, then you want to focus on getting those flies into that bottom third of the water column, because that's where the fish are. If you're fishing with dry flies, getting your flies to the right spot just means that you're casting either where you saw a fish rise, or you're putting the flies in the right spot to eat them in those specific types of water that we discussed earlier. So being able to make that good cast with your dry flies is important at this point, but you've also got to identify, maybe you didn't see a fish rise, but you can look at it and say, oh, there should be a fish there. I'm going to throw this cast there. An undercut bank would be a good example, or the head and tail of a pool, or the seam on a pocket. Being able to identify those, and then you move and you put your flies on them without any drag. That is the key. Now, what is drag? Well, it's just an unnatural movement on your fly. Fancy term for it is all it is. It's actually pretty easy to spot. If you're fishing with dry flies, you'll see drag when your line starts to pull on your dry and it makes this little wake behind your dry fly. It's going to look like it's riding a jet ski sometimes, but it's not a natural movement, because I've used this example hundreds of times, but it works really well. Imagine a leaf falling onto a river, if you've ever seen that. Well, when that leaf falls onto the water, does it start moving around on its own, or does it let the current push it around? It lets the current push it around, and it just moves with the flow. That's exactly what you want your dry flies to be doing, because that means they're getting a natural drift. They look just like the real thing would look if it was on the water. For nymphs, Drag is pretty easy to identify as well, because instead of looking at your dry flies, since you don't have any because you're fishing nymph rig, you look at your indicator instead. If that indicator has any drag on it, then your nymphs do too. You want that indicator to act just like a leaf on the water. You want it drifting along, not being pulled by anything. The only thing that that indicator should react to is when a fish eats your bugs or your flies get hung up on the bottom or in moss or whatever it is. Now, remember, I want to make sure this point gets driven home. Your goal as a fly angler is to put your fake flies out there in such a way that the fish think they're real. That's all you have to do. If you focus on that skill, you're going to be in business. And these three things that I just talked about, those are the building blocks to being able to do that. Yes, casting is important. Understanding your knots is important. But I see so many beginners get out there and worry about everything. Well, did I do my knot right? Or is this rigged up correctly? Or did I use 17 inches of tippet where I should have used 18? Those little things matter, but not really. Not in the grand scheme of things, because your goal, what you should be focusing on, is putting your flies in front of a fish and making it look as natural as possible. If you can do that, then yeah, it might be frustrating when you lose a fish because you had a bad knot, or maybe you do need to change your rig to get to the right depth, whatever it is. But that's all stuff that's a lot easier to identify and to understand than this stuff. This is the complex stuff. This is the stuff that takes more time and effort and mental energy to master, because it's so different than anything else that you've probably done with any other fishing that you've probably done. So focus on that stuff. Don't get hung up on the weeds, pardon the pun, and just focus on this stuff. And that's what's going to help you accelerate your growth as an angler. Now, hopefully that answered those questions and that took care of that topic. But if there's any follow-up that y'all would like to hear, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. I'd love to offer more clarity on this topic if I could. And with that, folks, we're going to wrap up the open to the show. We're going to move right into the Q&A section of this week's show.
Anglers are always asking, what bugs are hatching right now? And that's why we put together a year-round hatch chart. It outlines all the major bug hatches so you always know what fly to tie on, no matter where you're fishing or what time of the year. So if you want to level up your skills and start catching more fish, click or tap the link in the show notes to get this free hatch chart. All right, back to the show.
Every week, I dedicate half the show to directly answering questions from listeners and viewers. And sometimes, like you just heard, the questions y'all send in become the basis for the opening of the show as well. So we need questions. We love them. I love to hear from everybody and catch up with y'all. So if you've got a question that you would like answered on the show, there's a link to send those in the show notes. Our first question this week comes to us from Brandon from California. Writes in and says, "Thank you for all the great content. You are very entertaining and I always learn something. My question is, when setting up a dry dropper rig, is there a general rule for dropper size, assuming a chubby Chernobyl or elk hair caddis is the dry? Dry size versus dropper size, and how much does no bead, brass bead, tungsten bead affect things? Should I go 2 hook sizes smaller on the dropper?" Hey, Brandon, thank you. I appreciate it. Appreciate this question. The only rule with dry dropper fishing is that you usually want your dropper to be a size smaller than your dry fly. Sometimes you will fish the same size flies if you're fishing a large hopper dropper rig. If you've got a big hopper up top, then you could dead drift a streamer under it. You could throw a crawdad type bug beneath it. But the whole idea here is that you don't want your nymph to drag your dry fly under the water. That defeats the whole point of the rig. At that point, you're just fishing 2 nymphs. So you want one one bug to float, then you want that dropper to not pull the dry underneath the water. Now, beaded flies are always going to sink faster. That's why we put beads and wrap lead around the shanks of the hook. In my own fishing and tying, all of my flies use tungsten beads. I rarely use brass anymore because I want them to sink well. And I don't have any issues with my dry fly sinking so long as I'm following that one size smaller rule. So if I've got a size 14 dry fly, then I need at least a size 16 nymph underneath it to complete that dry dropper rig. So that's what I focus on, and that's how I try to do it. And that seems to work really well for me. So thank you, Brandon, for sending that question in. I really appreciate it. Mark from Michigan writes in with our next question and says, "Hi, Spencer. I really enjoy the beginner fly fishing masterclass as well as listening to the Untangled podcast. And that has encouraged me to give fly fishing a try. Armed with my brand new fly flinger, I caught my first trout, a brookie, on an Adams dry fly the very first time I was on the water. It was an awesome experience. From watching the podcast on YouTube, I noticed that you have several fly fishing books on your shelf. Are there any books that you would highly recommend for someone who wants to learn everything there is to know about fly fishing and trout?" Well, Mark, thanks. I appreciate that you've watched all this stuff, and congrats. First time out, catching fish on a dry fly. You have no idea what you've just done for your life. You've improved your life quality. Heck, you've improved your life expectancy probably at least by 10 years. I mean, you have no idea how the quality of your life is just going to improve now that you're catching fish on dry flies. That's fantastic. Oh, in all seriousness, man, congrats. That's really cool. Thanks for sharing that with us. The best books that I'd recommend, there's really just one if you're trying to learn as much as you can, and that'd be Tom Rosenbauer's Fly Fishing Guide from Orvis. Tom's one of the best teachers in the sport. He's a great person, extremely talented angler. I have more respect than I can say for Tom. He's fantastic. And if you're looking for a book, I would be hard pressed to recommend anything else than what Tom's done. Now, as far as learning more about trout and their behaviors, some of the older stuff is actually really good. It can be a little dense to get through at times, but there's a lot of good information in a lot of that stuff. In the Ring of the Rise by Vincent Marinaro is a must read. He also wrote a modern dry fly code, which I actually have right here on the shelf. If you're watching the show on YouTube, I'm holding it up to the camera, modern dry fly code. When I say dense, what I mean is Marinaro was a corporation tax specialist. So you can imagine it's not the most engaging of prose, but it's really well written, really just full of a lot of information, a lot of insight that helps out. So those older books, even though they may not be as easy to read, they're worth your time. Now, most of the fly fishing books I read are actually the stories and collections of essays and whatnot. I'm more of a visual learner anyways. So, and with fly fishing being so visual, that's actually why we put the video beginner masterclass together. We figured that was a much better way to help people learn than blogs. In fact, we tried that early on in VFC. We tried to do a lot of blog stuff, and it just wasn't the same as being able to teach it on video. So, again, I'll link the beginner masterclass in the show notes if anyone's interested, but that's like the 5th time I've said that today. So hopefully y'all ain't sick of hearing about it, but, those are the books I'd recommend, Mark. And, hopefully that answers your question. Thanks a bunch. Kevin from Nevada has our next question, writes and says, "I was watching the fly fishing masterclass that VFC has, and I noticed you rock a chest pack when fishing. It looks relatively compact and seems to hold everything you need. What do you usually carry in your chest pack on a typical day of fishing? Multiple fly boxes? What rating of tippets and how many of them? Any specialty tools or gear that helps you get fish in the net? Thanks for everything and tight lines." Well, Kevin, thanks for your question and thanks for watching all the stuff. It's awesome. Yeah, the chest pack's nice. I prefer it. I used to wear vests all the time, and I like those, but they started to hurt my shoulders and my back. So I tried out a sling, and I absolutely hated it. And I tried the chest pack, and now I'm sold. Chest pack's where it's at for me. The only downside to it is that I can't wear the chest pack and the GoPro at the same time when we're filming. So that kind of does suck. But that's the only problem with it. Anyways, I've got 4 fly boxes, and they're actually talked about what's in my bag. I think it was 2 episodes ago. We're on 97. So it should have been episode 95. I talked about that. I've got 4 fly boxes. I don't carry too many flies with me. And then I've got spools of 3, 4, 5, and 6X tippet. That 3, 4, and 5X, I've got it in nylon and fluorocarbon both, but then I just have nylon 6X because I have yet to get into a situation where I actually need fluorocarbon 6X while nymphing. I just haven't needed line that light and delicate in a very long time. I'm sure some folks get into stuff like that, maybe on some of the more pressured waters or the limestone creeks back east or whatever it is, but I just haven't had a need for that stuff. And then I've got split shot and bobbers. I'm sure that's a surprise to y'all, but I do fish nymphs from time to time. I'm using the airlock indicators right now, but Alex about has me convinced to go with the Oros ones, so I'll probably be switching over to those. It's the same concept. They're just foam balls that go onto your fly line. But the Oros ones, I like how they sit on the line a little bit better. I do have my net hanging off my back with our VFC net release, but I did upgrade the net just a little bit. So it's got a deeper basket. It's got a plastic handle. It's different than the net that we sell here. It's a little bit lighter. I've got to keep that pack light. I'm hauling around all this fat while I'm on the river. I got to keep that pack nice and light. The only piece of gear I have that's a real big difference from anything that we have at VFC or any of the stuff that a lot of the team here uses is my Dr. Slick mitten scissor clamps. I absolutely love those things. They're a combo of forceps and nippers, and I like just being able to condense the tools into one, and they're like $15, so they're not expensive. That's really all I take with me. I do keep it that light and simple because that's just how I prefer to fish. Now, you asked about specialty gear that helps to catch fish, and the only one that really does it is my beard. Every angler needs a beard. In fact, we're going to start selling strap-on beards for those who can't grow one. This has been a passion project of mine since I joined VFC, and we're finally getting those out to market. You're going to see your fish catching rates go sky high after this. I promise. Oh, no, I don't have any specialty gear that helps me catch too much. So it's just the stuff that I listed and whatever rod and reel I'm fishing that day. So hopefully that helped, Kevin. Thank you a bunch. And if I can clarify that at all, just please let me know. Taylor from Utah's got our next question. Writes in and says, "Hi, Spencer. I am a new fly angler and started in early June of this year. I've watched all of the VFC beginner videos and they've helped me tremendously. I'm getting the hang of catching fish, but the problem comes with keeping them hooked. I know you lose fish from time to time, but for me it happens quite often. It seems when I set the hook and start to strip/reel line into the net, the fish all of a sudden just come free. I keep constant tension and I also fish barbed hooks. There are no tippet breaks or knot failures. My fly just pops out. What can I do to stop my fly from popping out? Am I hook setting too hard, too late, too early?" Hey, Dalen, thanks. And thanks for watching all this stuff. I'm glad it was helpful. Appreciate hearing about that. First things first, stitch those barbed hooks. Just pinch them down with your forceps. The barbed hooks, they help a tiny bit with keeping fish in, but they're just not good for the fish. And they're a lot easier to take out of your skin when you bury one in yourself, which you will do if you do this long enough. You'll catch yourself plenty. And getting a barbless hook out's way better. Without being with you, without being there on the water with you, Taylor, it's hard for me to say for sure. So I'm going to make some assumptions here, but my gut is telling me that if this is a consistent problem, then there's got to be slack being introduced at some point during the fight with the fish. Fish are going to spit hooks almost always because slack gets introduced to the fly line. That's why the hook pops out. Now, there are some times where the fish can initiate that slack, where maybe they dive really deep and they put too much pressure on your fly line and then there's slack on their end and they can pop it out. Or maybe they get just the right angle that they can work the fly free. That's all possible, but that's not nearly as common as you would think. There's got to be slack somewhere being introduced to the fight. And the most common spot for that to happen, especially for beginners, is immediately after you hook up or when you're trying to strip your line in or put fish on the reel. That's a very common place for it to happen. Just an example, I remember clearly tons of times when I was starting out fishing, I'd set the hook and I'd pinch the line between my fingers and the cork, just like we're taught. And then I'd look down at my hands to start reeling or stripping line in. I wouldn't keep an eye on the fish. I'd look right down at my hands. And when I did that, my rod tip would drop slightly. And that would be just enough slack for the fish to spit the hook, scamper, and go to his buddies and laugh at me. Did you see that? I got him mad again. I spit his hook and now he's upset. Look at him. So, yeah, it's entirely possible, Taylor, that you're keeping tension, but just not enough tension on the rod. You want a fairly good bend in that rod throughout the fight because that means you've got tension on the fish, but It also means that you are engaging the whole rod to fight the fish, and you're not just using the tip section to fight the fish. You want to use the butt section of the rod. It's the strongest, stiffest part of the rod. That's where the power comes for lifting and pulling fish out of the water and putting them into your net. If you just stand there with your tip sky high and just try and strip and reel, you're going to lose some fish that way because you're not engaging your full rod, and you're going to have issues. Landing and reeling in fish on a fly rod is a much more active event than just standing there with your tip up, reeling the line in. So my suggestion would be to ensure that you are adding enough tension on the rod. Keep a deep bend in the rod. Don't let the tip get down too low when you start reeling, and then try to utilize that entire rod to fight the fish instead of only using the tip section. If your hook sets were the problem, because you did mention that, you wouldn't have the fish on for too long before the hook popped free. Now, there is the chance that you might be setting just a bit too quickly and you're not getting the fish all the way in the mouth. Maybe you're pulling the fly out really quickly and you're just snagging them barely on the side of their mouth, and that's why they're throwing the hook. So you could toy around with slowing your hook set down just a little bit. One thing I have noticed beginners do is they tend to either be really fast or really slow on their hook sets, and then they need to find that middle ground. So maybe that's another thing you could work on. Again, it's hard for me to know without actually being there and fishing with you, but I would suggest focus on the tension first, and then if it's still an issue, start tweaking your hook sets after that. So thank you for that question, Taylor, and I appreciate it. And folks, that's not the end of the show. That's the end of the Q&A section, but we still have the Live Real Life moment coming right up. Every week, I share a story from a listener to end the show. These Live Real Life moments can be about any of your experiences out on the water. We just want to hear about them, and we want to share in your journeys. We love to get pictures. We've even done videos, and then tell us about it. Tell us about what was going on. There's a link to submit your own Live Real Life moment in the show notes. And this week's Live Real Life moment is from Micah. Writes in and says, icy water licks my exposed calves, and my toes have lost all feeling. I'm meandering downstream, flinging my dry fly almost lazily into the pockets that look like they could potentially hold fish. Earlier that day, I'd landed a small Yellowstone cutthroat, putting me at the halfway point of a cutthroat slam. At this point, catching another fish would be like a splash of cherry in an already delicious glass of Coke. I scan the water and see no telltale rings to suggest that the fish are rising, but my purest wannabe self keeps the same dry fly tied to my leader that I've had all day. After all, it's summer. I don't need a nymph. A deep emerald pool comes into view downstream. A thick tangle of small twigs and larger branches forms a brambly dam at the other end of the pool. Crystal clear water spills over the top of the obstruction, falling out of sight into a pool below. Out of every pocket I have fished today, this looks the most promising. A gentle pull on my reel sends a delightful tinkle through the air. It's the sound that occasionally stops my heart as a holy crap fish takes a desperate run for freedom. My arm gently raises the tip of my rod, allowing the new fly line to slide out. With a quick snap forward, my fly goes careening across the pool towards a slow-flowing foam line. The fly lands softly and starts its lazy drift towards the beaver dam. My son chooses this moment to make his boredom known by seizing my hat and yanking it from my head. A favorite game, but not when I'm focused. I quickly snatch it back, sending him into a burst of giggles. Having lost all sense of where my fly went, I bring the rod tip up again and see my fly skitter across the top of the water towards me from close to the thicket. Relief at not having lost my fly to the brambles is marred by some disappointment. My hopes of feeling a wiggle on the end of my line had been in vain. There just has to be some fish in this pool. I rolled my line forward once more, rolling my fly line again into the foam line. Concentrating once again on the little white parachute, hat in hand so as to avoid distraction, I watch it drift and drift and drift. Anticipation is growing for the splash I know must soon come. My fly is now dangerously close to the death trap of snags. Within a millisecond, there is a flash of silver, an explosion of water, and my arm instinctually lifts. The fly flinger's tip bends desperately to stop the silver beauty from making a mad dash over the edge of the dam to the pool below. The splashing sounds from the leaping trout are masked by the excited chants of fish, fish, fish erupting from my toddler. With hat still in hand, I begin to bring line in strip by strip. The frantic struggle ends almost peacefully as I'm able to slip my rubber net under the glimmering fish's lifted head. I take a second to admire this beautiful coloring and fatness of this wild creature. Carefully, I wet my hand and remove the fly from its soft lip. It writhes in the net, splashing water on my sleeve as I prepare to bring it up for closer inspection. Cradling its soft underbelly in my wet hand, I snap a quick picture and allow my son to blow an admiring kiss before I turn the trout upstream, releasing it back into the cool embrace of the water. Straightening up, I take a deep breath and bump fists with my expectant young buddy. My fly flinger had once again given me an opportunity to glimpse something purely wild. I love living real life. Well, Micah, that was absolutely fantastic. I love the story. I love it. I love it. I love the storytelling. I love the time you took on this. And we showed that picture for those listening on audio. We showed that picture while I was reading the story, but there's the picture as well in the show notes so you can look at it too. But Mike, I think I speak for all of us when I say that. Well done. You outdid yourself. That was fantastic. Thanks so much for sharing that story with us. And with that, folks, we're going to wrap things up this week on the show. If you could, please like and subscribe, rate and subscribe, like it and rate it, and subscribe to us wherever you're listening to the show. The more ratings we get, and 5 stars is welcome. Don't leave a 3-star review, either 5 or 1. The middle ground doesn't do anything for anybody, but hopefully it's all 5 stars. But the more ratings and subscriptions we have, the more folks we can reach and the more people we can help to live real life. And if there's any questions you would like answered about fly fishing, or if you'd like to submit your own live real life moment, the links to do so are in the show notes. And with that, folks, get out on the water, have a great time, and until next week, tight lines.